Good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is a meeting of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Higher Education and Community Colleges. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We'd have the clerk call the attendance, please.
Chairman Huizinga.
Present.
Representatives Johnson.
Here.
Brand.
Present.
Green.
Here.
Slaw.
Present.
Vice Chair Braybeck. Representative Hammoud. You have one.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Today we have two presentations. We have Dan Hurley, he's here in person, and Bob Murphy from the Michigan Association of State Universities, and Robert Lefevre and Colby Cesaro from Michigan Independent Colleges Universities. Each will have about 30 minutes to make their presentations. During that time, we have a hard stop at 10 o'clock, so we have to be cognizant of our time because of COVID. I'd like to have you go for about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more, and allow for questions after that for each one of you. So I'd like to have Dan Hurley start us off, please.
Well, good morning. Good to be here. It's, I think, the second time I've been in this building in a year, so it's still a year into this pandemic, still pretty surreal. Well, good morning, Chairman Huizinga. Thank you for leading this committee, and Vice Chairman Johnson for your leadership as well, and to the new committee members. Look forward to working with you this legislative session. I'm joined by Bob Murphy. He's on Zoom. He's my colleague. He's my co-pilot. He is our Chief Policy Officer and has been with me in this role and at this association for about 5 years. Prior to that was at the State Budget Office for 7 or 8 years, serving as the fiscal analyst for the higher ed budget. So it's been very helpful and has provided a lot of data that you're going to see in this, this presentation. So let me see here. I do have, I'm going to not take 20 minutes, I hope. I want to have some good dialogue here, but I do have a lot of information that I'm going to present here. And I hope it'll affirm your appreciation for the state universities and for higher ed, and even more so the role that the state plays as it invests and partners with these institutions. A bit about the association. We've been around for about 70 years. We were founded in 1952 as the Council of Presidents, and they have been getting together ever since that time. But the organization has grown. We have a very extensive committee structure, about 18 different committees representing all the various leadership groups on campus. Certainly, the group that you work the most with are the state relations officers, the directors and vice presidents of government relations. And we have a mighty staff of 3. It's Dan, it's Bob, it's Robin who runs the office. And you look over to Wisconsin, for example, or North Carolina, New York, and they have centralized state agencies that oversee, mandate, dictate, etc. We do everything in a voluntary capacity, a collaborative capacity. So we're conveners, we're advocates, we're policy analysts, we're innovators, collaborators, partners, and we get a lot done. I'm very proud of our work. We have 15 great state public universities, remarkably diverse in their missions. The University of Michigan was a university 20 years before Michigan was a state. And on the other side of the spectrum, Saginaw Valley, Oakland University, Grand Valley State University are among our younger institutions. Very diverse missions, obviously locations, academic offerings. Some have obviously very huge medical healthcare research enterprises and a national reputation for excellence. And of course, it just really needs to be affirmed, they are public universities serving a very public mission. It's about workforce development, talent development, but they do so much more than that. And that's what really excites me as I go about this work, advocating on their behalf. So I'm going to be presenting a lot of data that I think is actually pretty powerful, tells a pretty powerful story. But by far the most powerful story are the 270,000 students that are enrolled at our public universities. They are come from all over the world, all over Michigan, every county, every background, and their lives are being changed as a result of being enrolled at our universities. And as a result, they are also changing their families, not just for this generation, but for future generations, and they're changing their communities and our state overall. What you see there here are just a few testimonials from current students giving advice to incoming students or high school students that might be interested in high school. Themes are make sure you tap financial aid, do your homework, get involved in student activities, find a mentor, whether it's a peer mentor or faculty and staff. It was called the Students of Michigan campaign. We have dozens and dozens of these testimonials on a website called Get My Degree. It was an enrollment marketing campaign, and you can find more information about this website and the resources on it on the pen that you have in your packet, and which actually contains a very good, Representative Johnson. I see you got right to it, but it's a brochure contained inside the pen, and we're very pleased to try to facilitate enrollment for students all across the state. So one of the reasons, probably the primary reason, why we have a set of institutions of public universities in Michigan that are well above grade. We are the Lake Wobegon of public universities. We're above average, and I mean that genuinely, and you take metrics that matter, and we'll go toe-to-toe with any set of public institutions in this country. And the reason for that is the governance model, by and large. We are the most decentralized set of institutions in the country. We are the most market-based, market-responsive, innovative, pivoting set of institutions. And that is because of the independence that these institutions have. They have constitutional autonomy. They are governed by 8-member governing boards, elected and appointed. And these are remarkable people that come from all types of backgrounds that provide oversight, accountability, counsel, and helping the leadership teams advance and their missions. So let me turn to a little bit about the labor market, and I find this interesting. We, of course, in Michigan have a industrial heritage. There continues to be, appropriately so, a lot of focus on the skilled trades. My overarching statement is we need more of everything. I'm not here, I would never say everyone needs to have a 4-year degree. That's not the case, it wouldn't work. But we do need to have more people with higher levels of credential. And one illustration of this is the state's own labor market forecast, which shows that when they look at the 50 high demand, high wage, in this case anything above the median average for occupations in Michigan, jobs through 2028, 38 of those 50 occupations require a 4-year degree or higher. I think that's telling. And then when they look at the annual job openings in those 50 occupations, there's going to be 52,000 job openings every year in those occupations that require a 4-year degree, and only about half that for occupations that do not require a 4-year degree. This is a very common chart. It simply demonstrates that as individuals, the more you learn, the more you earn. We know that there's higher income based on higher levels of educational attainment. That's important, but equally important, especially times like these when we're dealing with a recession, the pandemic, is job security. And you see there a very strong correlation with job security, or said another way, a lower likelihood of unemployment, the higher level of education you have. So the more you learn, the more you earn applies to individuals, but it also applies to states, and this is really, really important. Here, if you can read that, my colleague Bob Murphy put this chart together just yesterday with the most up-to-date federal data available. And it has a selection of states, and it shows their educational attainment ranking in the country and their income ranking per capita. and it just tells a remarkable story at the state level. The higher level of that residents have in this case a 4-year degree or higher, higher incomes as well. And the flip is true. So if you were to go to the Deep South, we picked on Arkansas, 49th in educational attainment levels among their residents. No surprise, 49th in per capita income. In Michigan, look at that, 33 and 33. Perfect correlation there. Of course, the bad thing is we're at the back of the pack, and we need to try to increase that. So that is why our governor and every other governor across this country over the course of the last many years has set an educational attainment goal. Of course, we want to change individual lives, but from just a pure economic prosperity standpoint, it's this chart that makes that argument. We want to boost attainment to boost incomes. So this right here, these next two charts I think are absolutely fascinating in that it's not just about increased earnings and increased revenues back to the state. There is also a correlation in terms of the higher level of attainment, the less likelihood that individuals will need to access social programs, social services. This is a study that was done a couple years ago that looked at, try to quantify, as cruel as that may seem, every life in this country and looking at a net lifetime fiscal impact based on educational attainment. And what they did is they said, yeah, let's see how much people paid over the course of their lifetimes behind them, and of course forecasted forward every type of tax out there possible, but then also figured in all types of public assistance and social insurance programs. And what he found was this next chart, and that is when you look at, for example, in this country, individuals with a 4-year degree, over the course of their lifetime, their net impact will be a plus $380,000 to society. For those that stopped out of high school, it was $25,000. For those that didn't graduate from high school, it was actually a negative column. So in sum, as it says at the bottom of the slide, increased college attainment generates greater tax revenues, yes, but just as important, it reduces the need for government spending on public assistance and social insurance programs. This chart right here tells me that, and maybe this seems counterintuitive to some of you, but I think it makes the argument that state investment in public higher education is the most fiscally conservative investment the state can make. Turning to trends in state funding here in Michigan, one thing that is disappointing, and this is, I will say, a chart that's a couple years old from Senate Fiscal. I don't think they've updated since then, but even several years past the Great Recession, we were still the only area of state government that was still in a negative column, inflation adjusted in terms of state investment from all the categories of investment. It's the longer-term view that is a much more dire portrait. In 2001, we were ranked 20th in the country in state investment per capita in higher ed. We've dropped all the way down to 44th. What is telling, when you look at 2002, the state was investing $9,700 per full-time student. This year, we're down to $5,700 per student. You take the difference in those two figures, you multiply it times 4 years, 4-year college degree, that comes out to $16,000. So what those figures say is the state has shifted the cost of attending a public university from state to students and their families by $16,000 over the course of that time. Every state has a higher ed wave chart. This is going to be way too small for you to read, but what it shows is, yes, when the economy goes south, higher ed does get cut. That's not unique here in Michigan. It's a national phenomenon. But what has historically happened is when good times return, there's reinvestment in higher ed. That did happen, for example, in the 80s and a little bit in the 90s. But when that recession hit in the early 2000s, you see it was cut, and it never rebounded. And then the Great Recession hit, and we have essentially been on life support flatline for the last several years. And so I wish it was a wave chart. It's kind of become a very flat chart. So that gives you the history going back several decades here, and we would really like to see a period of reinvestment. Looked at another way, back in 1979, when you look at all the revenues that feed our public universities, the general funds of our universities, they have two sources: tuition revenue and state operating support. In 1979, 70% came from the state, and now that has completely flipped. Only 22% coming from the state, 78% from students. For context, nationally, that pie chart is about 51% state, 49% students, when you look at all states, all public investment. And the same story can be told on state financial aid. We have had some new programs, obviously Futures for Frontliners, Michigan Reconnect, that's good, but they only apply to students attending the 28 community colleges here in Michigan. We are only at about a third of investment nationally in state financial aid. A word about the pandemic. A lot of focus has been, in Michigan and across the country, what the universities did to pivot almost overnight back last March to continue instruction and student services and all other aspects of the university enterprises. I'm happy to talk about that further. One thing that I think is very important, though, is what the universities did to harness all of their resources to help fight this pandemic. The PPE, the turning over of facilities wholesale for people to live in, healthcare workers, for example, and a lot of partnerships with all types of entities, local partners, and I think that tells a story of how valuable these assets are in helping to try to combat, one of the greatest challenges of our generation. And of course, there's been a massive, huge cost impact. Report out last week, nationally, about $183 billion hit to higher ed in Michigan. At our 15 universities, we know that it's been minimally $1 billion cost impact. These have been cost increases, equipment, retrofitting of classrooms, testing in the COVID testing extensively, a lot of investment in educational technology, but it's the revenue losses, maybe even more so, that's been more profound. We did see a drop in enrollment, not surprisingly, and especially from international students, but it's the auxiliary enterprises. Some of these campuses have a huge operations in terms of housing, dining, parking, bookstores, entertainment, athletics, youth camps, on and on, that all just virtually dried up and had a very big impact. So there's been a lot of cost cutting. I read in a national report out last week, and the estimate was a 13% reduction in the American higher ed workforce in the last 11 months. And I'm sure there's some correlation with what's taking place here in Michigan. So layoffs, pay reductions, hiring freezes, across the board budget reductions, although I will say it's always been the goal of our campuses to try to protect the academic core, and then of course delayed capital projects. Just a word or two on, we are doing so much to try to boost student success. This is certainly pre-pandemic, but over the last decade, doing a lot of outreach to high school students, especially now. We don't have these state assessments, SAT, ACT, and so we've been working with the College Access Network and the other sectors, the high schools, to try to reach out to students, make them aware of college opportunities. And a tremendous amount is taking place in terms of innovations on the campus level to try to boost degree completion, and there has been good outcomes from that. And then it just does need to be reiterated that our universities are now spending over $1 billion annual in need-based financial aid. And of course, we're doing a lot on the efficiencies front. We're partnering, we're group purchasing on healthcare benefits, on our risk insurance, on a lot of other things to cut costs, to be more efficient. And we have a great story to tell with the other sectors, and especially our two-year partners, in terms of making the transfer process more seamless for community college students. So let me wind down here by what you really want to hear. That is a few comments on the budget that was recommended by the governor last week. First, we are certainly appreciative of an inflationary adjustment, 2%, for higher education for FY22. We do, however, have very significant concern with what is really an unprecedented aspect, and that is its one-time allocation. And any dollars are helpful, but as very large, complex institutions, it's really hard to plan and utilize that 2% effectively. So if next year, FY23, the state did nothing, those one-time dollars go away. And so, universities aren't going to be using these for hiring staff or other aspects, building new programs that obviously need to be sustained for a long time. So we would hope that there would be consideration to make those, nothing is permanent, but more longer term. There is a 4% current year supplemental planned of $57 million. That will be helpful, $57 million spread across the 15 universities. That is required as a compliance mechanism for the federal fiscal packages that have taken place in the last year. That'll go some distance to mitigating that $1 billion plus that the university, $1 billion cost impact that the universities have had to contend with. I could go at length about speaking to our long-term opposition to, I call it state-mandated tuition price controls, i.e. tuition restraint caps. This year, I think it's 4.2%. If this cap didn't exist, I don't think the universities would even go over it. But it just simply, when you have these caps, it has the potential to hamstring universities to strategically invest in new programs, in financial aid or whatever strategic investments that they might want to make. So this year's executive budget recommendation calls for an across-the-board increase of 2% for the universities. Our current year budget had a modest across-the-board budget increase. But for context, the prior 8 years, there was a funding formula that was utilized for new dollars that were provided to the universities. I could speak at length to this. I would just maybe point out two principles. One is, if there is going to be discussion about reviving a funding formula, to please include the voices of all 15 universities at the table. They are all impacted very differently depending on what type of metrics are used. And then the other principle, and this is a national principle, it's not coming from me just on behalf of the universities, is that if there's a formula used, to only apply it to new dollars that are being invested, to not reallocate existing state dollars that are provided to the universities. FYI, in your packets, I included a document, 1 page. It's a White House report from about 3 years ago, and it lists on the back side every state that uses funding formula for higher ed and what the metrics are that they use. And I've highlighted where Michigan, the 6 metrics that Michigan uses. Last thing I would say about the budget, we are appreciative that the governor has recommended a few eliminations in terms of reporting requirements that are included in the budget boilerplate language. That's very helpful because these are very burdensome and very often duplicative. And we look forward to working with this committee. We spoke last week, Chairman Huizenga, on maybe some additional changes to boilerplate that would reduce our load while still maintaining full transparency and accountability on the part of the universities. Let me conclude with we want to work with you as partners. Our universities are, I think, some of the greatest state assets that we have. It's my job, our job collectively, to try to inform understanding of the vital importance of higher education in this state. higher ed attainment and the role the universities play, and importantly, the role that state investment plays in helping improve college affordability and ultimately improving our economic circumstances. Included in your packets is a brochure. We have, for the last many years, the same 3 legislative priorities: increase state investment in operating support for the institutions, state financial aid, and then capital outlay. And we have all of the rationale, the latest data to rationalize those priorities. And for those of you interested in a real deep dive in some state higher ed policy issues, we have published a booklet. We call it the Michigan Higher Ed Public Policy Agenda. It goes in some further detail on probably 12 to 15 of the most common higher ed state policy issues in this country. And it's a document that I've created, imported from my prior job working on behalf of 400 plus institutions for a national group out of Washington, D.C. So with that, I do think Michigan's future is in college, and I hope you will join me in the ride. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Hurley. Deeply appreciate you being here in person today to present. We have a few questions from members. Rep. Brand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for being here. Like, as a small restaurant owner, we have a business model, and when we charge for a hamburger, we make profit. And I consider like colleges having a business model too, called tuition, unlike K through 12. So in that business model, if you didn't have to take some of our state money, couldn't you just, that tuition, how much more would it go up? And it sounds like sometimes if you didn't have that tuition barrier that we put on you, you might be able to do better without it and just do the business model like you should, like a restaurant does or a small business does, unlike K through 12.
So, yes, I mean, as I've said, we live in probably the most, from a business model standpoint, the most market-based public ecosystem for higher ed in the country. But what's most important to understand is the fact that every dollar of investment in the universities is $1 that's offset that the students and their families don't have to pay. And that's why, in this country, their states invest in public universities because there's a public mission. One of the great challenges in this country has been overall increased state disinvestment in higher ed, and that has led to increased debt financing of college educations. And that is very harmful. Less people are going to be investing in themselves, in their future generations, not going to college, not making more income, and that, not generating more revenues back to the state. And even for those that do debt finance their education, they get out, they're productive citizens, they're making more money, but instead of going to your restaurant or buying cars or buying consumer goods and services, they're sending a good portion of their discretionary income back to Uncle Sam in D.C., and that doesn't help kind of grow an economy. So what we need to do is bring together our collective will, help subsidize higher education in this state to make higher ed more affordable for more people to boost our attainment level, if that makes sense. But yes, I mean, students talk with their feet, and they will go to institutions on a whole bunch of factors. Price point and quality is one of them, certainly.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I admire that business model that you have, and you have reserve funds, and which is very, very prudent, and so I really admire that business model. But when you said like the social insurance, I mean, I didn't go to college. I was a C-average student at East Grand Rapids, but my business has paid over $2 million in Social Security and Medicare. So I'm not a college-educated person, but I've still contributed to that social insurance. As far as unemployment, 100% I contribute. I mean, is that figure in there? Is my figure in that, or is that just college-educated figure?
Oh, yeah, in that one study that I pointed out, yes, I think it would be.
So my figure's in there?
Yeah.
Even though I'm not college-educated?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Majority Vice Chair Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So looking at the enrollment data, we're seeing a substantial decrease in enrollment in college ed. We're seeing also a decrease in K through 12. There's some demographic shifts here. Just looking at last year, we were down 3.5%. 6.5% drop in freshmen, so that's very indicative, and yet we're seeing a 2% increase. I'm just a simple guy here. I look at the numbers, and I see student enrollment's going down 3.5%, but the money goes up. Shouldn't the money go down as student enrollment goes down?
I would say no. The primary aspect, short-term, pandemic-related, is the fact that the bottom has absolutely fallen out on the auxiliary side of these university enterprises, which has helped subsidize a lot of the operating revenues that these universities rely on. And these institutions are large, they're complex, they're huge ships, and so you don't want to change the investment model, the revenue model, the budget model, strictly based on enrollment. And the other thing too that I think is important is just like going back kind of to the business model, this near-term, short-term drop in enrollment has been challenging because of the pandemic. We are a graying state. We have we're I think the third highest forecasted decline forecasted in the short term for high school graduates. But the universities are doing a whole host of things to try to reverse that. And I think they will succeed in turning it around. There's a lot of populations in the state, a lot of things that they're doing to try to increase enrollment. So I think this is a near-term phenomenon. I do expect that enrollments will turn around.
I think as far as freshman enrollment, we're like the lowest since 2002. So this isn't that recent. There's been a number of years now we're seeing enrollment go down. And you say, well, there's big institutions. We can't just change that quickly. I mean, what? I guess this makes no sense to me.
So we have actually, as a sector, held our own. When you look at the various, so you have freshmen, you have graduate students. We are an in-migration state. We have more students come to Michigan who attend our universities than go out. We're a top 10 state in international enrollment. We have a couple 100,000 adults in Michigan that have some college, no degree. A lot of the universities are working to bring back those populations.
Maybe I'm being too complex here. So let's just simple number. At what percent does your enrollment go down that state funding should go down?
I don't think it should ever go down. When you look
enrollment
at
goes in 50%, cuts in half. You should still get the same amount of state money?
Absolutely, and more. And I think you can go back to all the data I just presented.
That would never happen anywhere in the private sector. Never. That makes zero sense whatsoever. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minority Vice Chair Brayback.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Hurley, for being here today. It's been really more enlightening to be able to talk about this. I have a question particularly about slide 18, and you were talking about the cost shift, and those trends. And I'm wondering about what the possibilities might be in terms of access or programs if our funding here in Michigan mirrored the national data.
It would be phenomenal. It would be a wholesale change to this state in terms of college affordability.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually asked that this morning, and if that influx was made,
Right.
Over the course of the long term, you would see incredible improvements in college affordability,
Mm-hmm.
More people attending post-secondary education, earning degrees and credentials, earning more. And that is a very positive, self-fulfilling prophecy. You would have great business retention. You would be able to attract businesses. Probably the best case model in this country was the Amazon headquarter battle. That was rather galactic. And Arlington won it. Virginia won it. Every state, including ours, said, we'll give you tens and tens of billions of dollars of tax benefits. Virginia said, nope, we're not doing that at all. We're going to invest billions of dollars in college education around STEM. And they said, that's what we want. We need the talent. So I think that would help. And, I just leave it at that. It would be very, very helpful. And I think partnering with the state, we could develop even more innovative financial aid programs that would increase participation among key populations that have not participated at sufficient levels in higher ed in the past.
Thank you. Chair, may I follow up?
We are out of time.
Okay,
I'd like
thank
to
you.
make sure that we have time for our next presenter. Dr. Hurley, thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we could go back and forth with lots of questions, and I'm sure you're available to answer other questions from members offline as well. So
Sure.
thank you. Next, we have up Robert Lefevre, President and of the Michigan Independent Colleges and Universities, make a presentation. Good morning.
Members, thank you for the opportunity to testify. As stated, my name is Robert Lefevre. I represent the independent colleges in Michigan. I have just a couple of handouts that are being passed out right now. I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview of our sector and then maybe make some comments on the governor's proposed budget and then go into questions. We have 25 members. They're the private, not-for-profit colleges in Michigan. On the back of your handouts are a list of all of our members, but they're the Adrians, the Albions, the Davenports. We have roughly 82,000 students enrolled. We've awarded this past year about 18,000 degrees and certificates, and of those, almost 12,000 are bachelor's degrees. We provide roughly 25% of all degrees issued in the state of Michigan come from our members. And our membership is very, very varied. We have, of course, the traditional liberal arts and sciences schools. We have the business entrepreneurial schools as well. And then we've got some very specialty engineering and design schools. And we're have students from all over the state. 85% of our students are from Michigan and from every county. 85% of our students roughly stay in Michigan after graduation. Institutionally, we have a 98% graduate completion rate in 6 years. About $1.6 billion in institutional grants and discounts are provided to our students on an annual basis. The average institutional student grant is almost $25,000. We have a lot of discussion about tuition costs. One of the things we need to focus as a sector better in on is what our net tuition is. We've all got the sticker price, and they're usually pretty large and hard to swallow at times for parents. But as you dig through it, in the main, our discount is roughly per institution is about 50%. Which is really high, and it hurts us both ways. It hurts on recruiting students because a lot of times folks don't go that next step to go through the financial aid problem. They just see the sticker price. But our tuition is actually in line with about what the publics are charging as well. Once you get through all of that, the discounting. The other big positive for our members is we've got a very low student-to-faculty ratio. It's currently about 12-1. And that is kind of the hallmark of our membership. We are, in general, smaller institutions, although we have some big ones. And they're very high-touch environments. And that, in the main, that I think that leads to a lot of our success. It is being smaller and nimble. Even our larger ones are still under 10,000 students. That's still fairly nimble. About 83% of our students receive some sort of institutional aid or grant. 25% of them receive the tuition grant. And overall, like I had mentioned, we're about 20% of the degrees attained in Michigan, but we are roughly 1.8% of the higher ed budget. The other document is just we wanted to walk through some of the costs associated for our institutions on the COVID crisis. We have had some help from the federal government. As you know, the first round was CARES, second round is we're referring to as CRISA, which is what's being sent out right now. And then the third piece is what we're referring to as CRISA 2, which is currently being negotiated in Congress. Of those dollars, our institutions received about $68 million total. on losses of about $240 million. So it certainly has helped offset some of the costs and challenges, but as you can see, there's still a relatively big hole between the two. And the other thing I wanted to point out was for a lot of our members, they are located in small towns. And in the main, they can make up roughly 20% of the employment of those towns, the Almas, the Adrians, the Olivettes. And in some cases, speaking of Olivette, that's all that's left. They had a big plant years ago, that's gone. The local K-12 high school is gone. So Olivette really is kind of Olivette College is the island for the town of Olivette at this point. The other piece I wanted to just touch briefly on the bottom before we turn it over, or to switch topics to the budget, is the changing economy and what Michigan has been focusing on in the last several years is at Department of Labor is really the hot jobs. And we put out a list of, the state puts out a list of 50 hot jobs every year. Of those, 12 require associate's degree, the remaining 38 require bachelor's degrees. Our members provide almost all access to all of those jobs through degree programs across the state. So we do have, there's a lot of discussion about curriculum and where the majors should be, where the investment should be, and we have kept pace not only with our traditional liberal arts and sciences programs and our business programs at some of our members, but also keeping aligned to what Michigan needs on the hot job prospect. So that's just a brief overview of our members and our students, really. Oh, I did want to mention one other thing. There is a persistent perception that our students are relatively wealthy, relatively white from the suburbs. But that may have been true at one point, but for the last 25 years, our demographic really is the access student. Almost half of our students are Pell eligible. About 20% of them are SEOG eligible, which are the neediest of the neediest students. And we have a higher percentage of minority students than either the public's or the state's demographics as a whole. And what's key is both female students and minority students graduate at the same rate as their attendance. So we do not have a disparity between white students and minority students on the graduation piece. So with that, we were pleased to see that there was an additional investment in student financial aid in the budget, although the programs that the governor is adding additional funding to, our students are not eligible for them because they're targeted at the community colleges. But 25% of our graduates are transfer students. So the new programs will, we believe, fill the pipeline and allow those students, after they get through the Futures for Frontliners and the Reconnect programs, there is an opportunity and a solid pathway for them to attend a four-year institution, whether it's us or the publics, because we've spent a great deal of time and effort in the last 10 years developing pathways and articulation options for students to go directly to a four-year without loss of credit and get out in time. One of the things that you usually lose as a transfer student is time. In the past, not all the credits would transfer. It generally pushed you into a different track. Now, that may be different for part-time students, but for the first-time, full-time freshmen attending a two-year, the numbers are actually quite encouraging as they move to four-year programs. The other programs were left relatively flat, including the institutional aid. There is a 2% increase for the publics, but the big three financial aid programs, the tuition grant, TIP, and the competitive scholarship are largely flat funded. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Oops. Questions, members? Yep. Majority Vice Chair Johnson, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So looking at kind of what you guys do, what's your thoughts, you have the privates, the publics, what is the thoughts of going to maybe a per pupil model, like a voucher system, and just dividing up the higher ed budget, and wherever a Michigan student decides to go to a college in Michigan, that money follows them, instead of this outdated system where we have public universities that we just give blank checks to, and then we have private universities that we do some scholarships for. Why not just let the student decide and let the money follow them?
We generally support student access through student financial aid. As far as my hesitancy on switching it all to a per pupil grant is that would fundamentally change our we believe fundamentally change our relationship with the state. With that largesse comes strings. And we generally have not wanted to move towards the institutional aid side. And keep it funded to the student. The student gets to choose where they go and how they spend their dollars in the current system, which is where we'd like to land. I recognize
that's what I'm suggesting
yeah,
from a voucher perspective, because there is a per pupil argument on the public university side. But I'm saying, why not just do a voucher? So that way you don't have to deal with that. It's the same as what you have today. It would actually be a higher number for your students. And then if they want to go to private or public, it's up to the student.
It's certainly worth looking at. I think if I recall correctly, we had a similar conversation about 20 years ago, and it didn't wind up going anywhere. But we're certainly always interested in talking about what we can do as a state to increase student financial aid. Because another point I wanted to make, we're the lowest in the Great Lakes region, and we're one of the lowest in the country on how much we spend in student financial aid. The governor's increase this year will move us a long way, but prior to this year, it's roughly $110 million. And to be a top 10 state, we'd need to spend roughly $450 million in student financial aid to really drive it. So anything that gets us closer to that $450 million mark, we think we would be supportive of and would want to take a hard look at.
Representative Slaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a question for you. What has these for-profit schools, I'll use Phoenix, the University of Phoenix, what has that done to your enrollment, to the process of education here in the state?
In general, the for-profit online schools and the nonprofit purely online schools do not have a very large footprint in Michigan. The largest one was ITT, and of course they failed just a few years ago. But in the main, they have such a small percentage of students, they're really not impacting outcome that much. And I think one of the reasons why they have such a small footprint here is because existing institutions already fill those niches. For example, Davenport University has been online since 1979. So they were already in the marketplace, and when you're looking for a new place to land, you generally don't take a place that's already saturated. We have a very robust marketplace in Michigan for higher education. It's a pretty great mosaic, right? We've got a number of community colleges, a number of publics, and a number of privates, and we all generally work together both on articulation agreements and students being able to move from one sector to the other without the loss of credit and still moving towards a degree. So in the main, I mean, although they are here, they do operate at some level. It really hasn't had a huge impact.
I have a question that's probably generally for both, but you mentioned net tuition and that process. Recently saw an article about Purdue University, and they're holding tuition levels level and going towards more of a net tuition perspective. Yeah. We had some dialogue in our office about that and what the impact is, and perhaps there's a perception that if your fee isn't high enough, you're not getting a great program. If it's really net, you articulated that not everybody gets tuition assistance, but if 80+% do. Are there any trends within your organization to move towards more of a bona fide number instead of it's a list price sugar sticker shock and
right.
No one pays list price?
There's certainly a lot of discussion going on around it. The University of Detroit Mercy has moved to that, where they have gone to a net tuition model. They've overall lowered their tuition dramatically. They still provide financial aid, but it's more on a needs base, a super needs base. And we're, of course, all watching with great anticipation to see how that works out for them, and hopefully it does, and that starts the trend. Nationally, it's certainly coming on a little bit stronger. There's a couple of things nationally that I think are worth looking at for our membership. One is the going with essentially a true tuition level, where you don't have the big disparity between net price and sticker price. The other piece is the elimination of ACT and SAT for admissions. We've slowly moved towards that. I think Kalamazoo College was the first college in Michigan to make it optional. As part of the pandemic response, you've seen a lot of schools, especially the very selective Ivy Leagues, have done away with it, and I think that's just a hastening of moving further and further away from that. One of the metrics that I always like to point to is, the ACT and SAT have the career and college readiness benchmark standards. Even if a student meets 0 of those benchmark standards, 40% of the time they still earn their bachelor's degree. So it's really not, to me, it's really not telling us whether or not they're able to persist through the process. What it's telling me is how they scored on a test. In Michigan, we start telling our third graders that if they don't get a certain score on a standardized test, that they're not college and career ready. And so if we want more kids to go to college, we've got to stop telling them in the third grade that they shouldn't go to college. To me, it's really not about whether you got an A in this subject or not. It's the persistence, it's the maturity, it's the long-term trend that a grade point average provides us. That gives us more actionable information, in my view, on the admissions side. And I really would like the state and nationally to shift away from you get a high score on a test, that means you're going to do well in college. There's no, in my view, there's no correlation.
Yeah, I would
Sorry,
agree.
sorry, I drifted a
Yeah.
little bit off
No,
on
that's
you
good.
there.
Representative Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Being, independent colleges, are you leaner and meaner as far as administration costs? I mean, you have to fight probably a little bit harder without getting some of those state money.
Well, it's certainly a leaner program. We would refer to, I don't know that we'd call ourselves meaner, but we do run.
That's a compliment.
We do run fairly lean. I mean, we have, in most cases, on the executive side, on the administrative side, every member wears multiple hats. We run a number of work groups for our membership, and we've got a CFO work group, an HR work group, a financial aid work group across the board, and one person from a single institution could be on all 3 of them because they wear all 3 hats. So we are, just by our nature, we run leaner in the main.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Nope. If not, I think we're done. Thank you for coming today. Really appreciate that information. Members, we do have a schedule that'll be coming out to you just to help you understand what the next meetings are going to look like. We have, lots of institutions that would like to speak, so just to help you prepare for that, that should be coming forth soon. And seeing no further business, this meeting's adjourned.